Yeah, started.
Thank you, Simon. Good morning. I would like to call the meeting to order today for the special meeting of the Hartford Subcommittee of the MARB. Today is May the 2nd, and the time is 10:01, and I do have a quorum. This special meeting has been rescheduled from April the 25th. And we will be sticking to the agenda as it is. The only thing with no other topics of discussion today besides the items that are on the agenda. And we would like to change the order of the agenda today due to the fact of people's scheduling at the city and the Board of Ed. So
Good morning,
I'm going.
Steve Alsigno.
Good morning, Steve.
Morning.
Thank you for joining.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And so we are going to begin today after the minutes with making a change and have the city and the mayor present the 25 budget, and then we will move on to the 5-year plan. So agenda items 4 and agenda item 5, and then we will move to the Board of Ed second. With that, I'd like to then move to the approval of the minutes from January the 18th. And a draft of those minutes has been included in the packet. And if anybody has any questions, otherwise I'm looking for a motion for approval.
So moved.
Thank you, Bob. A second?
Second.
Steve Alsigno.
I heard Lisa first, so I'm going to go with Lisa. Thank you.
Okay. I defer.
Thank you. Any other discussion? I hear none. All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any abstentions?
I'll abstain because I wasn't here.
Thank you. All right, the minutes have been approved. Over to item number 4, which is now 3, and that is review, discussion, and possible action of the mayor's FY25 recommended budget for the city of Hartford. With Hartford being a Tier 2 municipality, according to the statute, the MARB has authority on certain items of the annual budget, which is the revenue area, and I will give you the detail of that in just a moment. OPM staff has provided the subcommittee with a memorandum of those items, and also provided to the subcommittee is a copy of the October 2023 grand list. Subcommittee members have received copies of the city's budget for FY25 and as well as the 5-year plan. In that city's budget, you're going to notice that it is $623.8 million, and it's a 0.75% increase over last year. And the mill rate is looked to remain the same from the prior year, is what we've learned. I'm going to pass this over to Mayor.
No, I can't think about it. Okay, good luck.
I'm going to pass this over to Mayor Arpalumpa and Julian, and to provide us with an overview of the budget.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And I'll start there with the top lines, as you mentioned. This represents rise in both revenue and expenses of just under 4.7 million. We wanted to ensure that we were able to balance this budget without raising our mill rate, which is at 68.95 mils, is in spite of a reduction after the last reval of about 5 mils, is still the highest mill rate in the state by a sizable margin. And it's important not just for residents who are struggling with costs in our city. It's important because our commercial sector and commercial properties downtown are really important to maintaining the fiscal stability of the city. And we wanted to ensure that we were holding the line on our mill rate. It represents a cost increase of 0.75%, as you mentioned. The vast majority of that is payroll first, and then utility expenses. In fact, the two of those represent more than the rise in expenditure. If you take those two out, there's a reduction in the rest of the budget, small reduction in the rest of the budget, and then we continued to fund negotiated wage increases. These were some negotiations with unions as a whole, and certain negotiations on specific positions that have been really difficult to fill. One example is license and inspections, which is specifically a position that because of the backlog in building inspections has slowed down development, and it's the type of investment that we think will actually add to the grand list and grow the fiscal stability of the city, and ensure our ability to retain and recruit employees. And then, we continued to fund our capital investments out of our general operating budget, continuing not to bond. Those capital investments have been lower than they were last year, but continuing to fund it out of the general budget. We created a few, and I hope you have the deck in front of you, but we created a few investments in high priority areas for us. One was sports and recreation, which we view as part of a larger engagement with our youth, and also creating productive opportunities for youth after school, and also I think an investment in violence prevention in this city. We did that by funding 3 new positions and then moving 5 existing positions out of the Department of Families, Children, and Youth. We created a business one-stop, which is an office that is meant to sort of be a liaison to navigate, to help a concierge service to help new businesses navigate City Hall through the licensing process, the planning process, fire marshals if they're involved. It is a position that, for budget reasons, sits within development services, but reports to the mayor's office. It's 2 new positions, but again, I think the type of investment that should grow development and business in our city, and hopefully add to the fiscal sustainability of the city in the long run. We created a new Office of Violence Prevention, and the new head of that Office of Violence Prevention has worked closely with the head of our Sports and Recreation Department, and also closely with the PD and with nonprofits to try to coordinate and expand violence prevention efforts. And then a housing liaison. It's not a new full-time position. It is an increase for an existing position, but makes it 24/7 and responsive to housing complaints within our city. On the revenue side, we had a decline in property tax collections. That decline was offset by an increase in the grant from the state, an increase in pilot payments for tax-exempt properties of about $4 million, and an increase in budgeted revenue from our interest and investments. We also saw a modest increase in building-related permits due to development in our city, which for a number of reasons is a hopeful sign. On the expense side, as I mentioned, payroll accounts for about 92% of that, the addition in our budget, the $4.7 million. About 4.3 is payroll related, and those are negotiated increases with unions. We think really necessary to retain good employees and to be able to recruit new employees. And then utility costs account for about 13% of that. We have an electric contract that's probably the biggest one of it. We had a 5-year contract coming up for negotiation this year, and we expect that to rise substantially. There's a reduction in our operating budget contribution to CIP, the capital investment program. We budgeted $22.96 million in this budget, and as I mentioned, continuing to budget for it out of our operating budget. MHIS saw an increase in software maintenance and funding for repairs, just regular maintenance of the network infrastructure, and as I mentioned earlier, the utility increase is largely driven by electric, and after that, natural gas. We broke down in this the components of the expenditure base. As you can see, as always, education is the largest piece of that, followed by payroll. In the following page, you'll see the components of the expenditure base. If we break out the education piece, payroll and staffing account for 40% of it, a little over 40% of it, followed by benefits and insurance, and then pensions and cash payouts. We'll touch on in the 5-year plan, sort of the rising cost of the ADEC and some of our thoughts around that. On the benefit side, 72%, almost 73% is our health insurance payments from the city. And I know we have on this slide, on this fiscal year 25 presentation, the kind of 5-year, some bullet points in the 5-year plan, the longer term sustainability. I won't go through that in detail now, because we'll give you our 5-year plan in a moment. But at a high level, I think protecting our property tax base here within our center business district, continuing to grow our and bring back our commercial buildings and strengthen the large scale downtown buildings is going to be very critical to maintaining a stable property tax base in the city, and then continuing to attract investment and growth in new ways. And we are working on a number of development projects to do that. The capital investment plan that we put together, just under 23 million, continues improvements in flood control. We are working obviously on those efforts collaboratively with the MDC and with federal partners who have recently brought in about 4.5 million that we hope will, and we hope possibly another 1.5 million for projects in the north end of Hartford. But working with the MDC collaboratively to try to figure out a long-term plan.
Oh, we have a bad connection, I think. Julian, are you still with us? No, he looks frozen too. Mayor, it sounds like we have a little bit of a bad connection.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Did you lose me?
Yeah, I did. It beeped out. Both you and Julian did.
Oh no. How far back did you lose me?
We just lost you when you were talking about the capital improvement part, and we heard about the flood related and the work that was going on at the north end. But that's when it stopped.
Okay. The other two major categories are traffic improvements,
Thank you.
and roads and sidewalks, and so I think that is kind of gets through the presentation. The last slide on that, and this is kind of adapted from the public presentation we did here in the city. We put together a little tool for Hartford residents to be able to put their property tax amount in and see how it's broken down by department. And so it's an interactive tool to try to get our residents kind of more familiar with the budget process and how their dollars are being spent.
Great. Julian, do you have anything else to add with that, or are you all set?
I don't have anything to add at this point. I think you already mentioned the memo that was put together by your office that outlines the components of the MARB's review of the budget, and so you folks can walk through that, and then we're available to answer any questions.
All right. And so I'm not going to walk through the memo unless unless the members ask me that they feel that that's necessary, because it's just a few components of the of the overall budget that I think that the mayor has already pretty much touched on. But any questions from the MARB members for the mayor or Julian?
Okay, Kim, the question having to do with the police. I saw that there was going to be an attempt to replace vacancies, which have been a nagging issue for a number of years. And I'm just wondering how that's going to be accomplished. We were hearing that, you were training a bunch of people for other cities. I mean, how are you going to try to get police back? Is there bonuses or what have you?
Yeah, there are, I think the recruiting has been an ongoing effort that we've built on year after year. There's a number of incentives specifically for Hartford residents, and there's assistance on taking the exams. We hire personal trainers for Hartford residents to get through the physical portion of the exam. We have a liaison and community liaison who does consistent outreach. Every time there's an event at a high school or at Capital Community College or across neighborhoods in the state, I see the community liaison there with the truck, talking about somebody who's from the community and represents members of the community, talking about the benefits of joining the Hartford PD. The PAL program has continued to grow year after year, the Police Athletic League, and I think we see that as a long-term recruitment tool for the PD. But I will tell you that Hartford is not unlike any major city or minor, mid-sized city in America. Recruiting police officers has been really difficult in this age, and so I think our police department has tried to be innovative and do everything we can to recruit police officers, and has also thought again about the ways in which we do policing. And I'll tell you, one of our new recruits who I met recently at a roll call came to the police department because she's passionate about issues in homelessness. And we have a police officer here who's dedicated to homeless issues, and so she's going through the regular training. She's going to be on patrol for a few years, but her goal is to kind of fill in that role. And I think the police department has done a good job of talking about the very many ways there are to be a police officer, and the diversity within the department that is growing and is trying to recruit. And it's an ongoing process. I think there's no quick fix to recruitment within a police department. But I think that this department is thinking strategically and long term about how do we build the kind of relationship that makes folks in Hartford and in the Hartford area think seriously about a career in the police department.
Are you saying that essentially that you're putting more emphasis on recruiting folks from the city than perhaps in past years?
I think it has grown year after year. I certainly think the Bronin administration did a lot to recruit folks from the city. For obvious reasons, I think people who grew up in the city of Hartford are most likely to stay in the city of Hartford long term. And so, I think that that's certainly where we have focused our recruitment efforts. But I think we try to add to and expand those efforts and think more creatively about those efforts each year. But it's a challenge I don't expect to go away anytime soon.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the members right now?
I do have a question.
Yes, Kevin.
Oh
no, Stephen. I'm sorry, Stephen.
So I was as you know, a police commissioner in Woodbridge for 19 years. And I'm just kind of curious, everybody, not only Hartford, we see it all over, is having a tough time with recruitment. And I've always thought that you need to get to the root of the problem. And I'm just kind of curious. I know money is always an issue. But is there anything else, in your view, Mayor? Is there a policy change that there's a reason why people don't want to become police officers, not only in Hartford, but in what you're on the job now for, six months about, and I'm just kind of curious what your take
Seems
might
like
be on that. Yeah, I'm sure.
I guess, I think it's about
So
4
I'm
months.
just kinda curious
Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious if you think that there might be some internal policy changes that might take place that might inspire people to become police, or if there isn't, if everybody's very happy with whether it's just a money issue, then that makes things easier. I mean, then at least you know that you throw money at something and hopefully it changes. So just kind of curious on your take.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. First of all, I think that the way in which we approach policing as a city has changed in ways that are really good. And public perception doesn't always catch up to the reality. But our police department works really collaboratively with our HEART team, which are, kind of community-led social responses to certain calls that don't require someone with a badge and a gun to show up. And they viewed that as a real benefit to them. Our police department has really embraced this new Office of Violence Prevention. And, yesterday we had an incident in an area where there are a lot of young folks and they have been congregating after school. And what our police officers have told me is that, everybody asked for police to show up and create a presence. And they said, this happens whether or not there are police there. It's just a question of whether people are going to get locked up, young kids are going to get locked up because of it. And so we've worked collaboratively with Office of Violence Prevention, the police, our sports and rec department. They went down there together after the incident yesterday, and we're working on a solution in that kind of hotspot to create some after-school activities for the kids that can be set up in parking lots that can utilize some of the school gymnasiums in the area, but that brings a community approach to dealing with issues of violence. And I think one of the things that has been difficult for police officers, and I know we're getting a little bit off probably the course of this conversation in a MARB meeting, but I think one of the things that's been difficult is a lot of officers have felt like they are expected to solve all of society's problems. And then there's a tension that is when there are more social based, emotional based community approaches to violence prevention. Some in the media and elsewhere try to pit that as something that is opposing police officers or seeking to eliminate funds from police departments. But in Hartford, I will tell you, and I don't know that this story has been told well yet, I think our police department has worked really collaboratively with that. And I think that if community members could see how those things work together in concert and how those things can coexist and a city in which we can honor the really important role that emergency responders play, that police officers play in public safety, and the important tool they are in our public safety approach, but don't treat them like the whole toolbox. I think it would be viewed as a more attractive profession.
Thank you for that feedback. I think that is important for folks to hear, and I think I do
Thank you.
agree. Go ahead.
Appreciate it.
Go ahead, Stephen.
I
Anything
appreciate
else?
your comments. Thank you. No, that's it. Great. It takes a while to unmute. I apologize.
No, that's okay. But I do think that feedback really is important, that I agree with you from the fact that, police officers can't fix absolutely everything, and that you highlighting the social side of it and the community sides of it and those types of programs, I think is really important to make sure that kids can get involved and, stay off the streets, right?
Yeah.
Any other questions from the MARB members on the budget?
Are you pretty much finished with tax appeals? Because I know that the whole valuation issue is going to be difficulty at some point, like come the reval, which is, we can, I guess we'll talk about that in the 5-year plan, but right
Yeah.
now for this year, how are you doing on tax appeals?
You'll see this in the memo. I mean, I don't think that we are through the woods. We still have a number of them that are in some process of either settlement or court case trial. Look, I think we budgeted very conservatively in what we expect we will have to pay back on certain tax appeals, both through the process that is utilized through the Assessment Board of Appeals and through these appeals on these larger scale buildings. We feel pretty confident in our assessments, but obviously, given the rise in valuations, feels like every major building has been appealed, and we are working closely with our legal team to try to mitigate the potential loss in revenue from those appeals. But I think that what we expect in terms of losses has been budgeted for pretty conservatively, and you should see those numbers in the memo, in the 5-year plan.
One final question. What 1 or 2 things about this budget gives you concern?
Thank you, Bob. You took my
Yeah.
question.
I've been around watching you for a while.
I think the in the current fiscal year, I don't know that there are major points of concern. I think we budgeted pretty conservatively in this fiscal year. We kept costs down. As we look through to the 5-year plan, my biggest concern continues to be the value of our downtown buildings and the impact that can have. We've got more commercial space in Hartford than New Haven, Waterbury, and Bridgeport combined, and we need to have a strong and thriving commercial sector, and then we need to be realistic about the amount of commercial space that we don't think is coming back, and work aggressively to come up with a plan together with the state to address that. And I think that plan will mean some conversion on Class B and C buildings, and try to push the existing commercial space into the more important Class A buildings. Not more important, but the larger Class A buildings that just frankly can't fail if we're going to maintain a strong property tax base. I think it's going to require thinking creatively about what can go into those buildings when they're it doesn't all have to be office space in the way that it was conceived before. I think there's possibilities for entertainment space and golf simulators and gyms and those sorts of things. I think there's possibilities for co-working space. We've got a growing residential community in our downtown, and many of them work remotely, and I think there's opportunities for co-working space. So I think we just need to think creatively about how we fill that office space in our downtown and keep those buildings sustainable.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions from the MARB members about the FY25 budget, or shall we move on to the 5-year where we can see the full plan? Okay, I'm not hearing anything specific at this point.
Kim,
yes,
this is John.
Yes.
Do they
I know we have to take action.
Subcommittee? Oh, okay.
Yeah, we do take action. I just wasn't sure if looking out would be more helpful, and then we could come back and take the vote unless the members feel differently before I leave this, because it's all inclusive.
Oh, I think we've historically looked at the 5-year plan and then see how this budget fits in. So I think
Yeah.
let's vote at the end of the 5-year presentation.
Thank you. That's what I wanted to do too. Perfect. Thank you, Bob. All right, over to you to give us an update on the 5-year plan and
And I'll kick it to
Julian?
Julian to kick
Sure.
this off, and I'll
Okay.
come back to talk about some mitigation measures.
Very good.
Thank you.
So Julian, we're looking for the 25 through the 29.
Yes.
Thank you.
So thank you. I'll just kind of give you an overview of how the forecast was assembled and then what it yields in terms of our projected operating results. So for the most part, the assumptions that we used to build this mirror the assumptions that we used in last year and probably several years at this point. There are a couple of notable adjustments to our approach that I'll highlight as we go along, but in terms of our projected grand list changes, we're running with the same projected year-over-year changes of 1.5% per year, which historically has been, fairly consistent. We did not build in any impact for revaluation in October of 2026, which would impact FY28 into our baseline forecast. So our baseline forecast has no effect of revaluation reflected in it, but we've kept the mill rate level. We've run with a constant collection rate using the FY25 collection rate. We've kept state aid flat, and on our payroll is based on existing agreements and then forecasted out beyond those agreements. And let's see, we've continued with a very austere capital plan. Our debt service is pretty minimal at this point. The only debt service that we're carrying in the city's budget for now is the revenue bond debt associated with the stadium and a very small Clean Water Act loan. Our pension projections are based on actuarial reports and forecasts. And so the significant changes in the way we've approached this, probably the single largest change is that in past years, we have used a very modest attrition factor. I think the MARB has even pointed out on several consecutive years that we use a very conservative attrition factor. You'll recall that last year we then, built in an attrition factor after our original proposal that was based on historical, turnover rates. And so rather than waiting for a second go at this year, we just built in an attrition factor into our forecast, based on historical rates. So our FY25 budget is based on a 6% vacancy rate. Forecasting out, we used for years 2 through 5 a percentage that is in line with our historical actuals. It's actually a little bit more conservative than what we've seen historically, but it's an attrition factor closer to 9%. You'll see that in the forecast. And so the results of this forecast, you'll see that in the short term, the first several years, the projections have the city in balance, and it's really not till years 4 and 5 when we start to see, revenues and expenditures diverge, and we've got some forecasted deficits. The other change in our approach, which I started to touch on earlier, is in our how we're addressing the revaluation. Last year, we built in an assumption that the 2026 revaluation would result in an overall grand list increase of about 3.25%. And in this year's forecast, again, I mentioned the baseline does not take into consideration revale at all. But do you mind if I share screen for a moment?
Please.
You should make reference to this one page in the report. And so you should see in a moment or two, it should pop up on the screen, this one exhibit from the 5-year plan that shows the projected additional revenue that would be generated under 3 different scenarios for revaluation. So we've got our baseline property taxes reflected there in the top row. The first scenario, scenario A, is just replicating the assumption we used in last year's 5-year forecast, which is an increase of 3.25% in FY28. And then based on analysis provided by our assessor and his observations of essentially where we are today. So looking at the market activity today as compared to the 2021 reval, he's forecasting that with no further changes, we would actually see an increase of over 10% in the grand list, driven almost entirely by residential values and apartment buildings. And that's also taking into consideration a roughly 35% decrease in the large high-rise commercial. So using that figure, we forecast that out. That's actually scenario C. And then scenario B is just kind of splitting the difference between A and C. So if it was something less than that 10.86%, we would be looking at additional revenues as they're shown in scenario B. So, depending on where reval lands, again, looking several years out, based on the best information that the assessor has available at the moment, those 3 scenarios would generate somewhere between, $5.25 million to, over $28 million per year in property tax collections. And again, depending on where that revaluation lands, it could offset or even more than offset the projected deficits for those 2 years. And if that were the case, if the additional revenue actually exceeded what we're projecting for deficits at this point, then the city would be looking at, doing some combination of either lowering the mill rate, building up fund balance, or allocating funds for various strategic initiatives, or some combination of those measures. So that was the sort of the stage that was set from the forecast, that we have these deficits projected for years 4 and 5, before taking into account reval. We know that reval is likely to offset most and perhaps more than those forecasted deficits, but that we're also looking, at what we can do now, some long-term initiatives that we can take now to move the needle on our expenditures before we get to those deficit years. Given that we have several years of runway where we're projecting balanced budgets, the focus of our efforts are really in terms of budget mitigation. We always continue to do the small things we can do on a day-to-day, year-to-year basis to cut costs and manage costs. But for the purposes of a 5-year plan, what are the things that we can do that will really have a structural impact on our costs? So, and those are outlined in the document, and I think the mayor is going to speak to some of those also. I'm going to stop sharing this slide.
I do want to thank you for all your work in order to close and change your methodology in your 5-year plan. This is, I'm pleasantly surprised, and I'm because of the change, and but I am definitely I think it is the right way to go versus making the changes being I always have called it ultra conservative versus conservative, and Julian will hear that word from me from when he worked with me closely, and I'm like, Hartford is ultra conservative and I think we need to get to more conservative. So when he said that he was going to be the budget person there, I said, please fix this. Please fix this. So if he has been chirping at you, Mayor, it is something that closing a budget in a 5-year plan, I think, is critical to then make that statement out there and know that you've already addressed it beforehand, instead of us seeing the changes and you're putting out that you can't balance a budget in the next few years, when we know that the history has been that you still have put surpluses on the bottom line, at least in my tenure here. So over to you. Sorry.
No, thank you for the background, and we certainly had that conversation. If you're putting it out there, just don't say this mayor is conservative. We have a number of, knowing that we have a couple of years to plan a number of cost containment, cost mitigation initiatives, and we kind of put them in 4 larger buckets. The first is on energy efficiency and renewable energy. There are a number of initiatives that started really in the previous administration around energy efficiency, and the primary goal was just that, trying to make sure our functioning was more green as a city, but it has this secondary benefit of creating a direct favorable impact on our operating budget. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the cost drivers in this budget has been our energy cost. Obviously, across the country, it's something we continue to expect to grow. So, first, we have developed an RFQ to seek an energy services company with the goal of reducing our operating costs within both city buildings and school buildings in our city, which we anticipate issuing in the spring of 2025. We've partnered through the state's virtual net metering program to support large-scale solar installations, and under the state's NRES, the non-residential renewable energy solutions program. We've been awarded a number of other additional solar projects, and we are working with the developer to implement a 4-megawatt solar array in the former North Meadows landfill and as well as on the roof of Weaver High School, which we target to be completed in fall of 2025. The second bucket is risk management, and we have already implemented a number of risk management initiatives that have actually brought our budgeted claims expense from $4.9 million down to $4.5 million. And we've expanded our 24-hour nurse triage, which was initially for DPW employees. We've expanded that to essentially all the departments in the city. We've made some proactive moves around slip and falls, had defensive driver training, overall safety trainings, and seen some real results from each of these. Our risk management department has continued to grow, and I think it's had an impact on our cost savings. We're exploring the possibility moving forward on billing health insurance for fire calls. A number of other municipalities have been able to bill health insurance companies for the cost incurred by fire departments responding to those calls. We are developing a plan for managed care, plan for workers' comp, as well as in partnership with that, a return to work program that allows for a range of light duty activities options given the job classifications and union restrictions. We are working on implementation of a driver vehicle safety software that has both GPS capabilities, but also on some of the larger scale, trash trucks, fire trucks, some video abilities too. It will also on the city vehicles have videos that can be activated during crashes to determine fault. But you know, on large scale sanitation vehicles, it's you know, we think these videos will be helpful with worker comp claims and also, you know, any crashes that occur, which obviously can get a lot more costly with the larger vehicles. And then, you know, work on subrogation on recovering the cost of damaged or downed street poles that are the result of third parties. We continue to incur significant costs from down street poles, and oftentimes those are the results of reckless drivers, especially around certain parts of our city. And so the recovering those costs could have significant impact. The third bucket is working in collaboration with our treasurer on reducing the long-term pension. Our ADEC payments have continued to rise as a portion of the general fund budget. It went up from 8.6% in fiscal year 24 to 8.8% in fiscal year 25. We'd like to work with the treasurer's office, with the firm Hooker and Holcomb that they contract with, and with any members of the treasurer's office, you know, any staff in the treasurer's office that they deem appropriate, to try to come up with solutions to reduce the long-term liability, the tail on those payments, and perhaps bring down the ADEC payments. It's something I've reached out to the treasurer about, had initial conversations about. Hope we can, you know, look forward to working with the treasurer's office collaboratively on. And then finally, you know, we've had a number of conversations that have increased in frequency given more recent developments with the Board of Ed, with the superintendent specifically, around working collaboratively on cost containment measures with the Board of Ed when it comes to special ed costs, transportation costs, the cost of tuition, which is a massive cost driver within the Board of Ed, and seeing if the city and the board can be on one page in front of the legislature in advocacy, and also in trying to come up with long-term solutions to the sizable and ever growing budget issues within the Board of Ed.
Thank you. Any questions from the members first? Julian, I do have one question. I didn't locate this in the mitigation measures, but maybe it's just that I didn't have enough time to actually dive into the materials. Did you provide us with the change in the overall budget that would consider changes to, as you mentioned today, the payment in the ADAC, but also possible changes to fund balance? You had a roll forward in the prior year that was built into the mitigation measures, but I couldn't put my fingers on it quickly, so I don't know if I missed it or it wasn't provided this year.
No, you didn't. So I think that was two separate things that I think you're asking about.
Yes.
So in the sort of, you know, these short-term, year-to-year measures, we had price, cost them out and forecast what the dollar impact would be. But for the longer-term measures, we did not, honestly, because these are longer term, and by their nature are harder to price out, because we for example, on the pension side, without knowing exactly what kinds of measures will ultimately determine are feasible, and worth pursuing. We don't really know what to price out. So is it going to be a partial buyback? Is it going to be some other change to the plan? So rather than guessing at numbers, and given that we have several years to, one, do feasibility analysis, evaluation, develop a plan for execution. For those types of measures, we did not forecast out. And then, the impacts of things like the risk management initiatives that are really, it would take several years of, seeing a movement in trend line before we could say, and we have seen this over time in the risk management area, but the impact of those measures is really seen in sort of the rear view mirror as you see claims coming down. Being able to attribute a certain dollar amount to a certain measure is not something I think we could do looking forward. And then you also asked about the projected fund balance. So I don't recall exactly what we provided in last year's 5-year forecast. What I would point out is in our budget document, we do out the did fund balance, unassigned fund balance in the executive summary portion of the budget. So it's on page 2.8, and this is of the large budget document on page 2-8. We do forecast out where we expect to be at the end of this year.
Do you have it on your screen that you could show it to me very quickly? Because I'm flipping through the power.
I will. Let me see how quickly.
If you're able to do that. I'm trying to do that. I'm just a little uncomfortable with the fact that, okay, so we're looking to take action today. And in the past, when I see the 2 years that you have a gap that would need to be closed, how can we equate and get comfortable with the fact that that you have proper mitigation measures that will be able to close that gap and or sufficient fund balance if you can't close the gap, that the fund balance would be able to cover that? I'm always uncomfortable with approving a deficit budget. So last year, when we came forward with deficit, which was even sooner, you had probably, I believe, perspective that I knew that your attrition was very low and the history had always closed the gap, and you had a fund balance that could cover that. And those years that the fund balance could not cover the gap, then you had mitigation measures that you would take in order to close the gap.
Right, I recall now. I think it wasn't fund balance. It was our safety net in those years was our contribution to capital and our contingency fund.
Thank you for helping me. Okay. And so that would then close the gap.
And in combination with we also have, again, still 3 years out on the forecast of the revaluation, but the revaluation, and we expect that the reval is going to close most of that, if not all.
Okay. Thank you. I think for the full MARB meeting, could you put some numbers to that and just give me a quick table so that this way it will close that when we get to the full MARB?
Yes.
Thank you. Mark, I see your hand is up.
Yes, we're on the 5-year plan, yes?
We are.
I find it uncomfortable that for the 5 years, you flat funded education, obviously, and in that flat funding, the anticipation, I guess, is that some of those increases will be absorbed by federal and state funds, increase in grants, which is optimistic at times. So I'm uncomfortable because, and I know the mayor being on the job for 20 years, 4 months seems like 20, I'm sure. But the issue is for the past, out of 8 or 9 years, it's been flat funded. So the local percentage of contribution to Hartford from the local used to be about 29%. Now it's down to 24%. And the gap has been filled with federal and state funding. And obviously this year's gap plus the enhancements through the COVID money, which is being eaten up and creating the difficulties. As I look at as Kim has mentioned, on the city side, it's ultra conservative or conservative. On the board side, as I went through its 5-year plan, it looks like they're trying to make their budget fit with no local increase, certain assumptions on federal and state funding, which I think is going to be it's fictitious. The percentage of increase alone, and we've gone through this as a committee, the percentage of increase into the magnet school structure is phenomenal, and it's having a significant impact. Special education is having an impact, and the difference between identifying outside the system versus in the system is a subject for debate at another time. But it's clear in my mind that there's going to be considerable drain on Hartford's budget through special education and the chef. Let's just call it the impact of chef from 1990. So I'm uncomfortable with a 5-year plan that has no increase for the next 5 years, with a drain coming from what we already know exists. Our data shows the percentages are phenomenal. So what you have is you're robbing from Peter to pay Paul. The regular education student is going to suffer because of the fiscal drain on the magnet school structure at all, and the special education and transportation. So reconciling in my mind to vote yes on the 5-year plan that doesn't accommodate for some increase, to me is I'd be approving a plan that really is just non-existent, unless of course Hartford, if they're forced to comport, they close schools and do whatever, which is going to have a significant impact on the education of the child. And I just can't be part of that. So understanding that this year's budget is this year's budget, and that we could vote independently on. The 5-year plan, I don't think it's conditional that we approve their budget conditional on. I guess it is a 5-year plan too. I personally have to see an increase in the education budget over the 5 years, because this, to me, it balances, but in reality, based on the history of this committee, looking at all those numbers as we went through Hartford's budget, it's just not going to happen. You could balance it, but you're cutting into the quick. And so those are my thoughts that I'd share with you. Legislatively, there needs to be a recognition that Chef from 1990 is 36 years old. It had no intention of creating a brand new school system called CREC, which it did, and who's funding CREC but Hartford, a lot of times through its tuition structure. So how Hartford has to deal with it legislatively, internal policy, I don't know. I do know, but that's your decision. What I do know is I'm having a very difficult time and more than likely would vote no on the 5-year plan if I didn't see an increase in the education budget. 2% is minimal at best, but at least it comports with some increase to get us on path of what I call proper funding. So, thank you.
Bob, you were next.
Thank you. A short question and a larger question following up on Mark. I'm not sure I understood the assumption by the assessor for commercial in the 26 reval. I heard 35%, but I didn't know if that was up or down.
That was down.
Down.
Okay, good. So that sounds conservative. Not ultra conservative. I share some.
No, I agree with that. My
I
ultra
share some
conservative
of-
was a different line that I was referring to.
I share some of Mark's concerns. If I understand it correctly, that essentially with flat local funding, and the continued increase in special ed and chef and so forth, the board is going to have to address that by cuts in the existing budget or state and federal money, which may or may not be forthcoming, which puts the city in a horrible position. And I think that Mark kind of opened the door that I think a legislative fix is needed. You can't have these mandates and no funding. And based on your budget, I don't see a lot of fluff that can go to the school. That said, there's still an issue, a big issue. And I guess I'd like your initial thoughts and what you might be doing. I know you're working with the superintendent, and we'll hear from her, but that's a concern.
Yeah, let me address that quickly, and then unfortunately I do have to drop off this.
Thank you.
Here, but and I appreciate the sentiment behind it, and I'll start by saying, look, as a parent with kids in public school, there are few mayors more concerned about education, and it is something I think you will see in the days and weeks ahead, that we are working very collaboratively with the schools on and trying to come up with solutions and taking a pretty active approach to the future of our schools here at City Hall. But let me say this. Look, I think we all know that there are few taxes more aggressive than property taxes in building economies of scale. And the city of Hartford just cannot be relied upon to fix the funding problems within our schools. And to point the finger at the city of Hartford, which in very difficult budget times, we are trying to come up with whatever solutions we can. It's, I think, not just a little unfair. I think it's just not a serious response to this. That we need assistance from the state to deal with these rising special education costs. They're taking up close to a third of the school budget. We need assistance from the state in figuring out, and we appreciate the movement on the tuition cap in this last session and the impact that will have, about $11.5 million in this year's budget for the school board. But we need continued understanding from the state on the impact that tuition is having in draining our schools of that funding. We need to work collaboratively on figuring out transportation costs, which I think are about 25 million and rising. And also, we all need to accept the fact that this federal funding was always meant to be for a limited period of time and papered over some really significant structural issues. And it might feel cathartic to blame the city for flat funding for the last few years, and certainly, that's a conversation we can have. And I think that there are a number of ways, by the way, beyond our contribution to the schools, in which we can help with the cost of the long-term costs within the school system. And we have had those conversations. And again, I think you will hear more in the days ahead and weeks ahead on what that is going to look like. But the core of this issue is not the city's contribution to the schools. The core of this issue is that we have, through in the inappropriate channels, through the judicial process, created education policy that has created benefits for a number of our students. 50% of our students go to choice schools. For those who are within Hartford Public Schools, and the city can't fix those problems alone. And we won't. We have been reaching out to our delegation at the state and working with our delegation at the state. We'll continue to do that and hope to do that collaboratively with our Board of Ed and with our superintendent. But we will continue to advocate for what students in the city of Hartford need. We can't be the scapegoat for a system that has for decades been inequitable and set up to disadvantage our students. I'm sure Lisa Hammersley will have something far more eloquent to say on this, and I'm sorry I will miss it, but I appreciate the time to be with all of you.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. Lisa.
Thank you so much. So I was really encouraged by the mayor's response. The city has not been extremely active up at the General Assembly in the past with promoting legislative changes to fix the structure that the state of Connecticut has put together in response to the CHEF agreement. Hartford Public Schools is really in a unique disadvantage that many other districts don't face, where every year they are starting off their fiscal year in a budget deficit because of rising tuition costs. General operating or general tuition costs, as well as special education costs. But there has been movement in my professional capacity. I run a nonprofit. We are an education funding organization that seeks to increase equity in the education funding space here in the state. And there has been significant traction over the years to try and change the tuition structure and the billing structure in the state of Connecticut. As you see, the Hartford Public Schools is counting on some savings from the tuition cap next year. There's legislation that would eliminate general education tuition billing thereafter in fiscal year 2026 and thereafter. So if that passes over the next few days in legislative session, Hartford Public Schools will be in a much better spot moving forward with general education tuition billing. Of course, this doesn't solve the special education tuition issue that the Hartford Public Schools and any other school district faces when a student exercises choice, but it's certainly a tremendous move forward to reforming the system and providing relief to districts like Hartford that have a lot of choice being exercised. I will say, though, I echo your comments, Mark, to the extent that in the future, reval results in the city of Hartford receiving an increase in tax revenue. I would personally like to see the city prioritize a small, if that's all that they can do, increase in their local contribution to education. Because you don't see it very often across the state that the local share is not increasing over time. I, of course, understand that Hartford is in a unique position and it's economically disadvantaged and its budget is very bare bones. But in the future, to the extent that they can have the ability to increase their contribution, I certainly would like to have the city step up and change its flat funding year over year that they've experienced with Hartford Public Schools.
Thank you, Lisa. Anything else? You're all set, Lisa? Okay. Mark?
Yeah. Yeah, just quickly, I hope, well, the mayor doesn't, it sounds as if he's concerned about being quote unquote blamed for what's the ills of funding for the public schools in Hartford. And it's not my intention to blame anybody as much as Lisa stated, to highlight policy changes and legislative changes that are needed in certain areas. Now, whether they needed to be done by a carve out just for the just under chef, that's one thing, or statewide. Right now, you're paying. It used to be 5, now it's 4.5 times before you get on the excess cost, and unfortunately, that's capped or reduced. So every year when they need money, so there are policy differences and legislative differences that are unique to Hartford within the special education based on the data that we've put together, which causes one to question whether policy changes are needed. And it's nice to hear from Lisa that they're making progress at the Capitol. And my concern basically is from a budget document, voting on a budget document that I know is just inaccurate. It cannot sustain scrutiny. Now, that's just an issue I have to deal with. That's kicking the can. In good conscience, I have to concern myself with the numbers I see in front of me, and I really get concerned on the continuum of flat funding at the local level for a period of 10 years now. So that's just not in my DNA, so to speak. So that said, I hope it's not interpreted to be of blame as much as policy, and I'm glad that they're looking forward to it in the future.
Thank you, Mark. I do think that you have brought this to the attention for over the years that you've been on this board, that it has been a legislative issue and a policy issue. So it isn't something that is new, and this mayor can't take fault for any of that. And he's new, as 4 months, and this is his first budget. So I do think we can give him some time to be able to make those changes. But at least this way he can hear some of the concerns that this board brings to his attention. Bob.
Yeah, to follow it, I trying to wrestle with the problem. I agree with Mark that you just can't approve a budget, that 5-year plan that is based on a wish and a prayer. But at the same time, I credit the mayor saying, we really can't do that. Can we put in, $5 million or something down the road? Maybe. So I think this a solution would be to add in mitigation, and I think he's already got something for the Board of Ed. That is, there will be legislative changes before before 28, when you're going into deficit, or some other date, so that we can monitor it. It's not the kind of thing everyone's going to say, well, the solution lies at the state. Well, that's nice, but if the state doesn't do anything, then you're left with, is the city going to fund the problem? Are they going to start driving out businesses? I mean, obviously, one of the strategies of the mayor is to try to boost tax revenue through businesses. That's kind of going backwards. So, and to some extent, if we can publicize the issue and said, we as an independent board have looked at this, and there's no way out other than through some state relief. Lisa may know the pathways more than I do, but I think we've got to highlight that and keep it on the radar at every meeting, because we keep saying, oh, it's a state issue, and it doesn't happen. So I just think it ought to be there certainly as a placeholder, and we keep it on the agenda. How we doing? And maybe there's some publicity. Maybe we should vote the 5-year plan down. I don't know. I think it's because we legitimately feel it. I don't believe in any, PR gambits, but, this is a concern.
Mhm. Well, today, any other questions before I continue? And then I do want to get ready to move on because that'll give us about 45 minutes. The Board of Ed is here. I see Paul is here, so I want to move on to that topic. But before we do that, from the city's perspective, if we're prepared, and I am, for the fiscal year 25 budget is the thing that is most needed for approval or consideration for the full MARB. Would like your thoughts on that, and if folks are comfortable with that particular budget for the upcoming year. I am, and we could take a motion on the FY25 budget for recommendation to the full MARB.
So moved.
Thank you, Mark.
Second.
Thank you, Kevin. Any other discussion? I hear none. All in favor? Please say aye.
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 All right. Stephen, are you still with us? I don't know if he is. I'll leave that to the transcript and let them understand. All right. All in favor is this, the budget has been approved. Thank you. All right. Last item on the 5-year plan. What are your thoughts? I would like to hold on that, but I'm thinking I would like to
agree.
see. Oh, thank you. Okay, you did say aye. Thank you, Stephen. And tell me your thoughts. I'd like to hear the thoughts of the members on the 5-year plan. I would like to make sure that the mitigation measures will close the gap in the out years, just to not just show numbers, some type of numbers to make sure, and or the fund balance is there for us to take a look at. And maybe if there would be any kind of consideration, as Mark had mentioned, Bob had mentioned, on in the out years, or some other measures for the Board of Ed. Oh, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, just to comment on that with Julian being there.
Yeah.
I would like, personally, I would like them to go back to see if in fact they could adjust for some increase, be it symbolic, in the education budget through mitigation plan, through other areas, through redirection of some money down the road after next fiscal year. If that is something that, again, putting all the faith in Julian, is something that really would create an upend things, then I think Bob's solution is a good one. Adding a sentence or two, committing to whether it's additional funds through X or through the reevaluation or whatever, that as we did with Hartford, that money should be set aside for OPEB, that serious, however you want to characterize it, shall be re-examined or examined for the purposes of directing that a portion of those additional dollars to the Board of Education, something like that. I'd like to see it in black and white so that at least you're there. If they can't do it, then I think recognition of future dollars down the road will be prioritized, if you will, with education being number one on the list for getting some of those dollars.
Yes, Bob.
I don't think we should require Hartford to put in more money down the road. I think this is a game of chicken. And Hartford can't put enough money to fix the problem. And when the state starts saying, maybe I'll give some money, but Hartford, you got to pony up, then they may have to come out of pocket. But I'll be guided by others, but I hope this isn't too radical, but I would vote as a committee to reject the 5-year plan on the grounds that it does not provide for some type of funding for obvious needs of the school. You can add some of the other, Kim had a couple other items which were fixable. But I think we've got to make an issue out of this. And especially if something may happen in the next few weeks in the legislature, or next year. I mean, we do have time, not a lot, but I think that might send a message, and a debate for the full MARB, in front of Jeff, that, we got to deal with this. So I would reject it.
I would prefer
I'll
not.
make a motion after other people have chatted.
Yeah, I would prefer not to do that because to me, we have more information that could be provided, and the mayor isn't even here to give us that information. So I think that if they give them one more opportunity, we could always hold another meeting. We don't need to take this up at this next MARB meeting. We've held 5-year plans by 6 months for one city. So I don't think there's an urgency. I think we should give them an opportunity to come back with a mitigation measure, then get that harsh, is my thoughts, and would look to let the city have an opportunity to do that. They've made a lot of strides. We've taken them down by a tier 3 to a tier 2. And so the operating budget has been approved for the 25 for a recommendation to the full MARB. I think on the 5-year plan, we give them another opportunity would be my suggestion. Kevin.
Yeah, I think that's well taken, and I very strongly agree with Bob, and I agree with many of the comments that folks on this committee have made. I would be curious to Julian if us either holding or voting down the 5-year plan, if there is some negative impact on Hartford, if that it will create problems for you. I think that's always going to be a concern for me. I do think that us having another meeting of the subcommittee to include some of those mitigation points, as well as what Mr. Waxenberg had talked about in terms of seeing a scenario by which there is some increase in the school funding. And I would also agree with Bob that I am very comfortable if this board wants to make some sort of statement to the effect of saying that it is not practical to suggest that a municipality with a mill rate of 68 and is our capital city and is incredibly poor and is already cutting hundreds of positions from their school system. It's an untenable situation to go forward without the state taking some action and some accountability for the amount of money that it does owe the city of Hartford in various state aid programs that it does not pay its full amount for. I'm very comfortable with that if that's the way that the feels like is the direction to go. But I would agree that I don't know if we need to vote down that 5-year plan. I think we could consider what action take in a subsequent subcommittee meeting. And then my question would still be to Julian, just what the impacts on the city that is, or if this is, we can go through this process without it having some negative effect on the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Yes,
Yeah,
Julian.
just to answer that question, that no, there wouldn't be any negative impact of delaying approval or going through the extra steps. So that's fine.
Great.
Thank you.
Then I would like to delay and move on this conversation, so then we could please give them an opportunity to give us some additional feedback prior to the next MARB meeting. And I will then speak with the secretary for him to decide whether he wants a separate subcommittee to be added, and or if we'll take the topic up at the full MARB meeting. I would like to give at least this half an hour, 35 minutes over to the Board of Ed, which is really important. Please, Bob, one last
just
thought.
one very small thing. I think the minutes of the meeting, the subcommittee report should reflect we considered rejecting the 5-year plan for the reasons stated, but decided to give more time to do it. And I think that will cover it. Bye.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, now over to the Board of Ed. And sorry for the delay. I wanted to give you a little bit more time to present your your budget, but we have heard from you, Paul, through the time, with giving us ongoing updates in where you're at with your budget process. So Paul, over to you to, or the superintendent, if she happens to be with us today, to walk us through your proposed 24-25 budget and definitely how you are looking to close the gap, because I know that that's been one of the issues that you have been working on so intensely over the last few months. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Good morning. And I feel a little like the elephant in the room. But I will say, I'll bring apologies on behalf of the superintendent. Ironically enough, she is actually at a convening with potential funders, and so is in transit at this moment, and that's why she's not with us. But certainly, obviously, this work is critically important to our district and critically important to her, and she's out there working to figure out if there's other opportunities to bring funding in. So I know time is tight, and I did also send the committee 5-year forecast just to give a sense of where our numbers look like they're going to go in the next 5 years. So I know we also, for our proposed budget, we sent you, I think, something like 26 slides. What I was going to propose to do is just walk through the 4 slides that represent our executive summary, and then offer to take questions, because I think going through all 26 is probably not the best use of our time. And so I'm just going to share my screen.
That's what I was going to ask, if you would do that. Thank you.
Yep. Oops. Sorry, I'm not sure if it's sharing the right screen. Hang on.
It says executive summary. Yep, it did say.
Oh, it did. Oh, I did the right
Yep.
one and then I stopped. Sorry about that.
You did.
Okay. Can folks see that okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. So I'll speak to the process very briefly. This was a process we started earlier than we have in a number of years, to make sure that we were giving sufficient time to engage deeply with our community. We held a number of community forums and meetings, developed a budget priorities in response to that. We had a retreat with our board. We made some shifts in our budgeting process. I'll speak briefly to that. Historically, we've used an equity-based budgeting formula to allocate staff to schools. For this budget, knowing it was going to be challenging, we actually turned that allocation formula into dollars, and we gave some autonomy at the building level for school leaders to make decisions about what was most important to sustain in their particular buildings. And you can see the other steps we took here. We engaged deeply with our unions throughout the process as well. So this slide is the highest level sort of summary of where we landed in our budget. And so what you can see, projected revenue of about 430 million. And what I want to say about that, I know we've talked about the flat funding conversation, and that's actually $300,000 less than our revenue in the 1920 school year, which was the year, well, it was the year the pandemic started. It was the last budget that was adopted before the pandemic. So it's important to have that as context, that our total revenue, our total dollars to spend supporting young people in Hartford are almost exactly the same as they were the year before the pandemic. And I think we all have great awareness into what's gone on with inflation over the last several years, and also relative to the pandemic, what's gone on in terms of the level of need experienced by our students. So what you can see is proposed expenditures of 466 million. That's before mitigation, of course. Now that represents a $42 million reduction in spending from our current year. And I mean, including ESSER in that, right? So we have had the benefit of COVID relief funding for the last 3 years, and that is ending. And I did hear the mayor talk about that. There is a way in which we were able to do things for 3 years that we were not able to do, or will not be able to do going forward, I should say. And there is a way in which that funding allowed us to kind of hold off some of the realities of the structural fiscal challenges that the Hartford Public Schools are facing. So we have mitigated $35.7 million of the gap between that 466 million in expenditures and 429 million in revenues, and I'll show that in a moment. We did leave in the current proposed FY25 budget a small budget task of 1.1 million. That mirrors something we did last year in the FY24 budget, where we had about a 2. In terms of the budget development and the mitigation, I already mentioned our equity-based starter budget formula. One of the realities of the COVID relief dollars is, again, we have the opportunity to support and staff schools at a level significantly higher than the level of staffing and funding that's driven by our equity-based starter budget formula that we've used for several years. And so what that means, one of the choices we had to make for the FY25 budget is to fund schools at the exact level of the equity-based starter budget. And that has meant some significant reductions in funding and staffing in schools, even though that was a priority for us to still fund every school at the level of that formula, not above it, as we've been able to do for several years. And there was some variability between schools and how much above that formula they were. And so because of that, there's some variability in terms of which schools, the level of reduction from one school to the next. The other thing we did as a priority was focus on reductions at central office over district services. So you can see the breakdown of positions in terms of school-based positions versus district-based positions. Our FY25 budget represents an 11% reduction in positions at the school level. It represents an 18% reduction in positions budgeted at the district level. And when I say budgeted at the district level, you see that 334 positions number. I want to be really clear. A huge number of those positions are people who are spending all day in schools. That ranges from instructional coaches who are out observing and providing guidance and coaching to classroom teachers. It can be tradespeople who are, making repairs in our building. So I want to be clear, there are not 334 people sitting in the office near me, but that's just in terms of where they're located in the budget document. They're located in district departments. So if we look at the bottom line for our proposed budget, you can see our FY24 adopted versus our FY25 proposed. And that FY24 adopted does include the ESSER funding that was used in the FY24 school year to fund whether it be positions or non-position programs and activities in our schools. So again, you can see the $430 million in revenue, $466 million in proposed expenses. That left us with the deficit you see there. Our mitigation strategies are a 5% vacancy assumption for FY25. We had a 6% vacancy assumption in FY24. We've been right about that 6% level for the last 6 or 7 months. But we don't feel confident that we're going to sustain a 6% level because of, frankly, the position reductions happening in our district and other districts around Connecticut. We don't believe as many positions will remain vacant. We are going to use whatever remains from our ESSER ARP, our final ESSER 3 grant, to offset some costs in July, August, and September. That's the $5 million you see. I mentioned the $1.1 million, $1.2 million expense task to solve during the year. You heard we've already talked a little about the 58% cap on gen ed magnet tuition. So in that $466 million in expenses, because we didn't know kind of where the legislature was going to land on that as we were building our budget, we built the full amount of tuition into our expenses. But it is looking, we're very confident at this point that 58% cap is going to be maintained. And so that's included in our budget as an $11.5 million savings. And this budget does include the need to use the $5.6 million balance in the non-lapsing fund in order to achieve balance in the budget. And then the last thing I'll speak to before we open it up to questions, what does this mean in terms of positions? So I gave you those numbers of 11% in schools and 18% in central office. What you can see here is our 23-24 adopted budget with ESSER, inclusive of ESSER, and our 24-25 proposed, and the percentage changes. And so in the what's included, I'm not going to read all of this to you, but in the what's included, we tried to break out sort of what we budget in our central office lines within the budget. So you can see administration is really 91, now down to 74 positions. But there are functions like, again, instructional coaching, speech language pathology, school psychologists, where the cost center in which they're budgeted is the central office, but those are individuals who are spending time out with teachers and students in schools on a daily basis. And so we have those 3 categories in central office, and you can see across central office, it's 74 positions eliminated, a reduction of 18.1%. And then in the school-based, there's sort of 3 buckets as well. So we have general education teaching positions. You can see a 14.7% reduction in those positions, 162 positions. I do want to highlight the footnote there. About 45.5 are resource teachers. So we were able to really provide more resource teachers in schools. And so resource teachers able to do small group interventions and also able to support other teachers, but not necessarily the individuals providing the direct instruction in classrooms. We're able to significantly expand our capacity in that area with the benefit of ESSER dollars. Much of that is going away in this budget, as you can see. But I just want to highlight the fact that it says 162.1, but 45.5 of those positions are resource teachers. And then you see all other school-based. So these are principals, assistant principals, executive assistants in the office, counseling, social work. There's 160 positions eliminated there. And then lastly, so those first two buckets are the ones that were the decision-making happened at the building level. So school leaders made decisions about how to use their resources in terms of their general ed teaching positions and their other school-based positions. There are also a set of district allocated positions, which you see there: special education, bilingual resource teachers, TESOL teachers, security officers, nursing, and custodial, where those are in school budgets, but the decision-making about how many positions happens at the district level. And in the case of, for example, special education, that's because the level of special education staffing in a given school is dictated by the IEPs of the individual students in that school, right? The level of service that's needed by those students. And so it's not as simple as sort of dividing by enrollment and figuring out how many staff are needed. What I will note here is that's the one category where you see an increase in staffing, and that is because of our special education, our bilingual, and our TESOL staffing is driven by the level of need of our students. And we have compliance requirements we need to follow, and we need to meet the needs of our students as driven in their individual plans. And so, for example, we have an increase of, I believe, 45 adult support paraeducators in this budget. So even as the net reduction in positions is 384, that's actually some increased reductions in some areas so that there are increases in areas to meet the needs of our students. And the last thing I'll emphasize, because this can be an alarming slide, and frankly, this was a very challenging budget. This reflects positions, budgeted positions. We are doing as much of the reduction as possible via vacancies and attrition. And so we're still working through the process of bumping that has to happen with our union contracts. And so we don't yet know how many individuals are actually are the subject of a reduction in force or a layoff. It's not 384, it's far less than 384 because we had that vacancy rate. So we're doing as much, again, through retirements, resignations, attrition, to avoid reductions in force wherever possible. We do have some, and we have started notifying staff if they're subject to a reduction in force, but we don't have final numbers on the extent of that. So with that was the very quick executive summary. And I am happy to pause there if there are questions. You have many other slides, so you're also welcome to reference other slides in the deck if there's specific questions about anything we've shared.
Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the answer to my question is probably in what you presented, but I didn't see it. Of the 384 reductions, which includes, attrition and so forth, how many of those are due to the end of ESSER and ARPA funding?
Yeah, that's a great question. It wasn't in there, and so we have had about 260 positions that were funded through ESSER ARP over the last couple of years. It's not a one-for-one, right? Because we did this, we were very strategic about the budget. So there are positions that have been funded with ESSER that we've made the decision to keep, and there are positions that are general budget that we've elected to move on from. But one way to think about it is because of the 260 number, about 124 positions over and above what was funded with ESSER are reduced in this budget.
So 124 are reduced. So that means you're keeping 136
sorry,
positions.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm going to confuse it more. What?
I didn't explain that. Sorry.
Of you threw out a number 124. I wasn't quite sure what that was.
Yeah. So what I did is there's 384 is the net reduction in positions, right? We had about 260 positions that were funded with ESSER. So I just did 384 minus 260.
Oh, I see.
So what I'm saying is there are about 124 positions over and above what we had been funding with ESSER that we've had to reduce beyond what was funded with ESSER.
I see. And as you may not have the exact numbers, and that's fine, but of the 260 ESSER, are some of the, I presume at least a few of those positions are being kept
Yes.
because you think they serve a
Yeah.
purpose even if they're not funded.
Yes. Yeah, so it's not a one for one. We didn't just wholesale eliminate the 260, right? Again, because we did that school-based budgeting. Even in schools, there may have been a school leader who felt like a particular resource teacher position has been invaluable to them that had been funded with ESSER, and they may have made a decision to reduce a different position in order to retain that resource teacher position.
That's where my question comes in. So were they able to then, if they had vacancies and continued to have vacancies, so while you said that the budget might have had 124 above the ESSER funds that are being reduced, you said that there are a number of them that are coming from retirement and vacancies. I'm going to assume that of the one within the 124, that would be retirement and vacancies in that number, not the ESSER number. So my assumption is coming from 260 positions were increased with the federal dollars that you received, and that was for additional time to come through the pandemic, and they were one-time positions needed. So did these folks think that they were getting permanent positions, or they knew that these were positions that were only temporary to get you through the pandemic? Therefore, 260, when they were hired, already knew they were one-time. I call it one-time because it's just the grant funding that you received.
So yes, they certainly knew. And so even our hire letters would say,
Thank you.
This position is temporary, it's funded with temporary dollars. What I do want to say, just as an important caveat, is I do not want to convey, even though everything you said is 100% true, right? The hire letters said temporary, they were funded with temporary dollars. There is a reality that the COVID relief dollars allowed us, I think the mayor's word was paper over some of the structural. I think the mayor said it, that the COVID dollars allowed us to paper over some of the structural fiscal realities facing the Hartford Public Schools. So I do not want to convey, even though they absolutely were temporary and we hired them in that way, I don't want to pretend that all of those 260 positions are not fundamentally necessary. Some of those
I understand.
are fundamentally necessary to the operations of the Hartford schools, and COVID allowed us to sustain them. Whereas without the COVID release dollars, they just would have been, those positions wouldn't have existed.
Okay. Thank you. Lisa.
Thank you, Kim. I don't really have a question more than just a general sentiment and feeling after looking over the details of this budget. You know, you're living in the confines with what you're operating in and the revenue that you're anticipated to receive from all sources. But when I looked through the details of that 384 positions that are going to be reduced throughout your district and the impact by school, in particular, and the details of the budget for fiscal year 2025, it is tragic to me that our state's highest need district in terms of the total student population is making such significant cuts across your school system. And I understand that those are very difficult, obviously, for Hartford Public Schools. I do not believe that the one-time federal resources were simply or allowed you to make additional expenditures that are kind of just in response to the COVID pandemic, as you just said, but really are enhancing staffing at your school systems, which would allow you to overcome the significant underfunding that your district had received throughout the history of time. But I really had a reaction looking through your budget. And I mean, you're making the decisions that you have to. And unfortunately, PS is where you go when you have a budget deficit and you have no other means of, solving your budget deficit because of other contractual obligations and your revenue limitations. But I'm sure it was a very difficult budget year. And you can see it reflected in your budget document. So no question, just a reaction after looking through everything.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I think if I can make a comment on that, I mean, I think we we all have a similar reaction. And we brought this to our board. Our board voted this 2 weeks ago. And very similar conversation with our board. They passed it, and with that recognition that it, we believe, as painful as this budget is, it was probably the best budget we could come up with the dollars that we have in terms of the things we were able to sustain, right? We've sustained performing arts, like some version of performing arts, visual arts, music in all of our schools, right? In a very hard budget year. And so, we're pleased with that, but there are very real, I'll highlight one, right? If you look on slide 20, we've reduced 23 social work positions. And unquestionably, we added social work positions with ESSER dollars. But the level of need from our students pre-pandemic, and then the increased level of need it's not like after 3 years, the level of need that surfaced for our kids as a result of the pandemic has gone down. And so we have plans, right, and strategies for how we're going to still meet the needs of our kids, right? That remains our priority. But I think I share that feeling of, as we've built this budget.
Mark. And thank you, Paul.
Paul, I'm sure that you heard the conversation earlier regarding the 5-year plan. Obviously, next year's budget's been approved because it really is way too late to jump in. But as you know, and I've been saying all along, is the concern is not so much the math. The concern is the aftermath. It's the programmatic impact that this is going to have. And I'm not going to repeat what Lisa said or anything like that, because it's absolutely true. But I will keep harping on the fact that in order for Hartford to be in an equal position, they have to be treated unequally, because the chef decision was earmarked for Hartford. And I don't think they understood the impact, the full impact of chef. So they still are putting Band-Aids on it rather than coming up with a policy carve out for a chef district, which is Hartford, even though Bridgeport's a choice district, et cetera. That's why I call it a chef district. I'm just concerned, obviously, like everybody, of the programmatic impact for next year on the kids. But I'm concerned that without any commitment to fix the unequal policy that exists now at the state level, you're going to continue to be in this position for a long time, or annually. And MARB, if we're still overseeing as we're doing now, are going to have to make some decisions too, I guess, by resolution. So, but I sympathize with your task, and I align myself with all the board members that are saying you're doing a tremendous job in a very, very difficult situation.
Great. Any other questions for
Kim, are we going to deal with the 5-year plan for the schools?
No.
Okay,
I mean, it's not our task to do. I mean, our role and authority is to approve.
I know we don't approve or something, right. But it just,
right.
I guess maybe it's incorporating what we have, because I'm just afraid, what do you do next year? I mean, it's just, you can see, I agree with Lisa, this is tragic, and I just see it getting worse each year, and we really have to drive a stake in the ground with regard to the state. I think we all ought to think about it offline, how to do that, but this is wrong. So.
Understand. Go ahead, Paul.
Do you want me to walk through our 5-year forecast? Is that helpful?
I mean, maybe you could just highlight the really, really bad things that are coming.
Well, I want to give right, it's not that the state isn't aware and working at it, right? And
Right.
so, you
They
know,
are.
one of the things I will name is, you know, I think in the 5-year forecast, I've added a sort of a new deficit mitigation piece to the 5-year
Yes.
forecast because that the bill that was referenced earlier, 5212, that we're hoping is passed before the session ends, would eliminate the gen ed magnet tuition forever. And so I did make an adjustment. You know, it's not, you know, the bottom line for us is, you know, I tried to do what I think is a conservative 5-year forecast in the sense that on the expenditure side, almost nothing is going up, right? I mean, our salaries and fringe are going up pretty marginally. And I would say in our forecast, our salaries and fringe are going up at a rate that will require us to make position cuts every year, right? Just given our contractual obligations. And so it's not like my forecast is not assuming level staffing, it's assuming reduced staffing each year. And the only things that are really going up in our forecast are transportation and tuition. And transportation, even, you know, our budget for next year for the cost of transportation is about $29.5 million. And I'm forecasting 36 million by 2030. That's pretty conservative. That's not, you know, it's big, but it's not crazy. The issue remains tuition, and the driver of our tuition is special education. So right, even I just want to contextualize, right? Our anticipated tuition for FY25 before the magnet cap was 122 million. I mean, 86 million of that was special education. So even if we have a gen ed, even if gen ed tuition goes away entirely, we're still forecasting significant increases in total tuition year over year. And so in our forecast, right, we're saying if it's 122 million in FY25, you know, this is conservatively 7.7% increases per year, which is actually less than it's been in some years. It'd be 176 million in 2030. Now that's before we take out the gen ed tuition. So it does help if the gen ed tuition is eliminated. But I just think that's a challenge. You know, we shared this budget with our city councilors last week with Hartford City Council, and a question came up about the excess cost grant. And we just put a number out to help them. And I want to be really clear too, when we talk about, and I know the superintendent would want to be clear about this too, when we talk about our special education costs, I want to be super clear. Like, we are 100% committed to meeting the needs of our kids and meeting the needs of our special education students, right? I don't want this to be framed as like special ed kids are taking something from other kids. We are committed to meeting the needs of our kids, whatever those needs are. But we have 250 students who exceed the 4.5 times threshold that triggers the excess cost grant. Those 250 students are projected to cost $34 million this year. So that's $136,000 per student. And the excess cost, because of the way it's done, right? We get the excess over 4.5 times, but we're only getting 72% of it. What we're going to get from the state is $8.5 million of that 34 million. So you're right, you're talking about 200 students. And so I just think that's, and again, I want to be really clear because I don't know who's going to watch this. This is not us saying it's their fault or it's the fault of special education. This is us saying that the revenue structures don't support the level of need for students we serve.
Understand. Thank you for that explanation, because I do think it's important that you do have to meet the needs of the kids. And this is a growing need. Now, as you are seeing, I saw the enrollment numbers and head count going down through those years. Is there a right sizing that will take place within the schools, or combining? Or I know that the superintendent has done some combining and closed a couple of schools in her tenure. Is some of that on the horizon again?
Yes.
And if it's here and I missed it, I apologize.
Well, it's in the 5-year forecast. We included it in some of our mitigation, kind of how are we going to address the scale of the potential deficits over the next 5 years. And so right sizing is the first thing on that list. And so we do have, I think, 11 schools that have less than 300 students. And so that is our, the decision to close schools, right? That's a decision of the board. And so our board chair has asked us to start compiling the necessary data to start, right? Because it's we have to figure out It's not just closing, it's like, well, where do the students go? And is the place where those
Right.
students go have capacity for those students? But we absolutely, and I will say, interestingly, in all of the community forums we had, because of the severity of our budget situation, in almost every community forum we had, people raised, are you going to close schools? Not in a negative way, actually saying, our community telling us they want us to look. I'm also not, I don't want to be naive, right? It's one thing to say about say it in the general. It's another
Right.
thing to say it when you're talking about a specific school.
Right.
But we are engaging in that process. The other thing I'll say though, because I know I've heard the superintendent say this, I wasn't here for the last round of closing and consolidations, but that was, I think, in her first or second year as superintendent. And my recollection is what she has shared previously is that that saved about $11 million. So we closed and consolidated a number of schools, but you know, I don't want to be naive either about how much savings we realize by doing that. There is some, but there are limitations to how much that's going to realize. And just to say, I mean, the other things, to be totally honest, right, tuition reform and revenue conversations with the state around special education costs. But I also think, you know, there has to be conversation about chef. I think the superintendent said that. I think I heard the mayor say that. You know, and even our enrollment projection, we are projecting continuing declining enrollment, but it's very hard to project because the way chef operates, right? Very few magnet schools in the chef environment are actually meeting their compliance targets relative to diversity, and sort of the addition of seats is a function of meeting compliance targets. And so it's not even clear, right? There's a plan to add seats, but how many seats are added each year really depends on whether schools are hitting their compliance targets.
Understand. Lisa, you had.
So you had an increase actually in your enrollment in this current academic year, didn't you? So I see that you're assuming declining thereout starting in fiscal year 2025 and thereafter based off of historical trends. But if you had an uptick in this most recent year, the assumption that your enrollment is going to continue to decline, I mean, you could realize something very different.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We could. And we're honestly not 100% sure, because particularly in the south end, we saw significant increases this year in our neighborhood schools. A lot of that was newcomers, so influxes to the city. We had some schools that actually exceeded capacity at the middle school level in the south end. In our neighborhood schools. And another thing I'll just say about Chef, right? After October 1 hits, right, we don't place kids there anymore. So any student who comes new to the city after October 1st is going into one of our neighborhood schools. I think the reason we projected a continuing decline is because that's the longer term trend. It's actually true in the last 2 or 3 years. It's still declined most of those years, but it's been a much slower rate of decline. I think what we're not sure about is how much was that slower rate of decline a function of the pandemic and people making different choices during the pandemic, and how much is that slower rate of decline actually the new long-term trend? I don't think we know yet.
Yeah, fair. And I will also state, like, excess costs, it would be great if the state could fully fund excess cost, but the district is still responsible for all the expenses getting up to that 4.5 times. And Connecticut is quite unusual in that it doesn't support special education costs until you get to that like catastrophic insurance level. So excess cost full funding is fantastic, but it's not like a solvent for special education costs and the burden on districts.
Yes. No, I think for us, there's a wondering about why is it 4.5 times?
Mark.
Yeah, just quickly, the excess cost was created prior to really getting into the chef and the choice model. That's what I mean about having an old system that's driving 30 years ago. That doesn't make sense anymore. It used to be 5 times, went down to 4.5 back in the beginning of the 90s. But, you know, I'm talking about policy differences, especially with chef. You know, the assumption was prior to choice that a school district, being frugal as it would not violate the IEPs or IDEA. They're almost forcing a local district to expend the dollars, which is a good thing for the children programmatically. But once choice came in, the statistics for chef are showing that the percentage of students that are going to magnet schools are much higher, are being identified after they've transferred at a much higher rate than Hartford identifies its own population causing and triggering a 4.5 times because there's no accountability and communication between the receiving and the sending district. There's no accountability. In other words, what you say is, we're going to send a bill to Hartford for $80,000 for educating Bob. Well, show us what the $80,000 is for. There's no regulation that forces anybody to do anything. This is how much we think it's going to cost. So the receiving district is not, there's no accountability. So Hartford just pays. That's unique to Chef. I'm not worried about Greenwich's special education costs, to be honest with you, because they don't have any choice students. They pay, all districts did before, but Chef created in its one of those unintended consequences, because I was heavily involved in that activity, but they didn't look past their nose. What would happen to Hartford over time? And those of us that were trying to project were being poo-pooed because the plaintiffs and the defendants, they were just screaming about more slots, diversity, more slots. And our concern was, that's fine, but you can't have the students that are left in Hartford picking up the crumbs. So they're really, all they've been doing historically is putting a Band-Aid like they did with the general education tuition cap. It's great for 11.5 million, but you have to think a little bit further than that. But I don't want to waste any more time talking about it, as much as say, as I already did, it's a very troubling situation that needs to be addressed legislatively and or policy at the state level, or the students of Hartford, I feel, special ed and regular ed, are going to suffer programmatically.
All right, we're a little bit on the top of the hour. Does anybody have any final questions for the Board of Ed or conversation needed? All right, I think we've touched on all of our agenda items. The only thing that is left is to make everybody aware that we have a regular MARB meeting that will be coming up on May the 16th, at which time we'll be talking about the budget again. And that particular meeting is going to be held at the legislative office building. And since this is a special meeting, we can't bring any new topics together. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
So moved.
Ooh, who was that first one? I'm sorry.
Mark.
Thank you, Mark. And I didn't get the second. Bob?
Bob.
Thank you, Bob. And all in favor? Say aye. Aye.
Bye.
Thank you all for your time, and to the city and to the board for your hard work with this budget. Have a
Thank you,
good day.
Bob.
Take care.
Thanks,
Thank
Paul.
you.
Thank you. Bye.